There's an old saying that in a free society, government fears the people, but in an unfree society, it's the people that fear the government. That's why it's important to say a few words about Ruby Ridge, which is one of the most defining cases of this decade as far as how the government views the American people and how it treats it and what the government thinks it can get away with. The Ruby Ridge fiasco began when an alcohol, tobacco, and firearms arranged to have a confidential informant set Randy Weaver up to sell sawed-off shotguns, thereby violating federal firearms laws. Weaver lived with his wife and 4 children in an isolated cabin at 20 acres on Ruby Ridge in the Idaho mountains about 40 miles south of the border of Canada. Weaver was a white separatist. He had never engaged in violence against other races, but he believed the races should live separately. Because of that, he targeted for a federal firearms sting because the federal government wanted to turn him into an informant to use against the Aryan nations. Once Weaver had sold the shotguns, he was pressured to become an informant. He would not do it, and what he did was just stay up on his mountaintop and refuse to come down. He was sent the wrong date for his trial. He didn't show up, and the government said that proves he's guilty. Once he did not show up, the government launched a massive campaign at him. The U.S. Marshal Service labeled Operation Northern Exposure, and a very elaborate months of surveillance. The Marshals called in the U.S. military to do an aerial analysis. The photos of his cabin were studied by the Defense Pentagon Mapping Agency. They had psychological profiles performed of the entire family, solar long-range spy cameras installed. They even knew the menstrual cycle of Weaver's teenage daughter and planned an arrest built around it. You can't criticize these guys for not planning. On August 21st, 1992, 6 U.S. Marshals snuck onto Weaver's property. The Marshals were in full camouflage, wearing ski masks, and carrying submachine guns and other high-powered weapons. 3 agents, 3 Marshals circled close to the cabin and threw rocks at the cabin in order to get the attention of Weaver's dogs. There is some evidence that the Marshals had planned to kill the dogs that day to make it easier to sneak onto the Weaver's property later on. Once the dogs started barking, Weaver's 14-year-old son, Sammy, and Kevin Harris, a 25-year-old family friend who was living in the cabin, ran to see what the dogs were agitated about. At this point, the U.S. Marshals took off running through the woods, followed by 1 dog. It was pretty clear from a confidential report the government has still not made public that the Marshals were panicked by a dog. Marshals later told the FBI they had been ambushed by the Weavers. However, according to the confidential report, the Marshals chose to stop running and take a stand behind stumps and trees. The confidential report says that Larry Cooper, the chief of this Marshal team, told the others that it was bullshit for them to keep running and that he did not want to be run down the trail and get shot in the back. The Marshals took up defensive positions and then surprised Kevin Harris and Sammy Weaver as they were running down the trail. The first shot was fired when Marshal Arthur Roderick shot and killed Sammy's dog in the hindquarters, so the dog was posing no threat to the Marshal at the time he was shot. Once that happened, there was following back and forth. Weaver came out of his cabin, hollered for his son to come back. Sammy yelled, "I'm coming home, Dad," and he was running back up the trail to the cabin when a federal marshal shot him in the back and killed him. Kevin Harris responded to Sammy's killing by firing in self-defense and apparently killing a U.S. Marshal. Federal agents testified in court that Marshal had been killed by the first shot of the exchange. This later proved that the Marshal had fired 7 shots from his gun during that exchange. The death of the U.S. Marshal sent the U.S. government into a The chief of the FBI's hostage rescue team was called in from Washington and ordered federal agents to shoot to kill any armed adult male outside the Weaver cabin. The federal government knew that the Weavers almost always carried guns when they went outside their cabin. There was bears, there was mountain lions, federal agents, all sorts of things in that neighborhood that posed a threat to them. And it was common for people in Idaho to carry weapons. And with a massive fire, and within a few hours, the 400 government agents were swarming around the Weavers' cabin in the mountains around them, with all kinds of automatic weapons, deadly accurate sniper rifles, the night vision scopes. The following day, Randy Weaver walked from his cabin to the little shack where his son's body lay to say one last goodbye to his son. Weaver was lifting the latch on the shack's door. He was shot from behind by FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi. Now, it's interesting, the FBI director, Louis Freeh, claims that Horiuchi shot Weaver, and the reason was because Weaver was supposedly aiming his rifle at a government helicopter. Horiuchi testified at federal trial that he never even saw Randy Weaver holding a gun. He was outside the cabin, so he tried to kill him. He was just following orders. Besides, there were not any helicopters in that area around the cabin at the time that Randy Weaver was shot. He was shot. He was struggling back to his cabin door. His wife, Vicki, stood in the doorway holding a 10-month-old baby in her arms and calling for her husband to hurry. The FBI sniper, Horiuchi, fired again, hit Vicki Weaver in the head, and killed her almost instantly. Once the bullet had passed through her, the bullet also hit Kevin Harris, who was also going in the door at that time. Once the FBI killed, seriously wounded all the adults in the cabin, the FBI sent an emissary to the Weaver cabin door to suggest that the survivors surrender. There was a FBI robot that rambled up to about 15 feet from the cabin door and broadcast a call for Weaver to come out, pick up the telephone in the robot's arm, and talk to the FBI. In the following 10 days of the siege, FBI press spokesman kept complaining that Weaver was so unreasonable that he would not even come out and pick up the telephone and talk to them. What the FBI didn't know was that in the robot's other arm was a 12-gauge shotgun pointed right at the cabin door. So here's I was just seeing his son was killed the day before by federal agents. His wife got killed a few minutes before. He was shot in the back. And he's supposed to trust the government. He's supposed to come out and smile in the face of a 12-gauge shotgun. Well, maybe that's part of the FBI's good neighbor policy, but it's an amazing what the government expects people to do after they already tried to kill them. Well, Weaver eventually surrendered, and Idaho jury found him innocent of almost all charges and ruled that Kevin Harris shooting of the U.S. Marshal was in self-defense. The federal judge in this case, a real conservative law and order fire-breathing guy, issued a lengthy list detailing the Justice Department and FBI's misconduct, fabrication of evidence, and refusal to obey court orders. Senator Specter of Pennsylvania fought long and hard to get hearings on this Ruby Ridge case, but the chairman of the committee, Senator Orrin Hatch, blocked those hearings for a long time. Senator Hatch said publicly that Lon Horiuchi was an American hero. And eventually said that any hearings that were held on the Weaver case had to be structured in a way to boost people's confidence in the government. If some German had said that about the Nuremberg trials, you wouldn't have gotten much out there from the information. But the whole idea that a high-ranking conservative in Congress would insist that these trials on the government shooting innocent people had to be structured in a way to boost public confidence in government, they have high expectations in Washington. Now, some people think that the Weaver case is just an isolated abuse and that time has gone on and it doesn't really matter. That's not what the U.S. government thinks. On March 1st, the U.S. Marshal Service gave its highest award for valor to the 5 surviving U.S. Marshals who were involved in the conflict at Ruby Ridge, including the Marshal Larry Cooper, who shot a 14-year-old boy in the back and killed him, and another Marshal, Arthur Roderick, who started the firefight by shooting and killing the boy's dog. The Marshals received the award, according to the Marshal Service Director, for, quote, their exceptional courage, their sound judgment in the face of attack, and their high degree of professional competence during this incident. The Marshals Director said the men were heroes. This is a case that we'll be hearing more about. There's a grand jury in Washington, D.C. that's currently hearing evidence against 5 FBI officials for their fabrication of evidence and other misconduct regarding FBI action at Ruby Ridge. And the papers are talking today about how the FBI's been ordered to do a self-investigation of what happened when it gave the 400 confidential files to the White House. It's amusing that people would still trust the FBI to investigate itself. It's a real triumph of hope over experience, especially for some of the frauds that have happened in the past with these investigations. 2 quick examples. In late 1992, just after Ruby Ridge, the FBI did an investigation of its action, and the FBI proclaimed in that investigation that Ruby Ridge had been a big success for the agency. The FBI report also concluded that the shooting of Vicki Weaver was justified because it said she'd been out in the front yard waving a gun in the air, possibly pointing at helicopters, shortly before she was shot. No evidence anywhere to support that. It was an absolute fabrication. That's what the FBI said in their internal official report on Ruby Ridge. Now, a second example, starting early last year, the FBI began to take a lot of heat for killing Vicki Weaver. FBI officials put out the word, and one agent even fired off a op-ed piece, which the Washington Post happily printed, that completely exonerated the agency in her killing by claiming that the bullet that killed her had first hit Kevin Harris and then passed through him and then accidentally hit Vicki Weaver. Again, there was no evidence whatsoever to support this. It was an absolute lie. This is the kind of evidence that the government never even suggested a trial, because there was a coroner's report that showed that she was hit first and then he was hit. But this is how the FBI sought to save its image.